you. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Can you hear me? I'd like to welcome everyone back to this conference. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in the morning. I'm Cécile Laborde. I'm a fellow here at Nuffield College, and on behalf of the college, I'd like to welcome you all to this conference, which we are delighted to be able to host. Unfortunately, only in this hybrid mode, but I hear it's worked quite well so far. So delighted to introduce our two speakers for this session. The first is Michel Bourban, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warwick, and he will begin. And his talk will be followed by Q&A, and then we will have, not as per your program, not Will Barclay, who I understand cannot make it, but he will be replaced by Pierer. So we're going to move up the next paper to this session, if that's okay. All right, Michel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cécile, for the introduction. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Pierre, as well, for organizing this workshop, and thank you very much for having me. So on the first slide, I've put the title of the conference. So one crucial question we are asking ourselves today is, how does the coming ecological crisis challenge contemporary theories of property? So one specific ground of justice that directly links private property with the idea of ecological issues is the ground of common ownership of the earth. So 17th century philosophers such as Grotius, John Locke, Hobbes, and Pufendorf all had common ownership of the earth as a theological premise, and they were wondering about what this would imply in terms of privatization of parts of the global commons. And since the Rawlsian renaissance of political philosophy, common ownership of the earth was quite a scarce ground of distributive justice. But over the last few years, there has been a kind of new interest in this idea of common ownership, especially applied to the atmosphere. And there has been also a specific interest for John Locke's theory of property applied to climate justice. So here in this presentation, what I would like to do is to explain why I think there are problems with this Lockean approach to climate justice and propose an alternative approach. So the first part explains what are those Lockean approaches to climate justice and what is their most important limitation. The second part proposes Limitarianism as a possible alternative to Lockean approaches to climate justice. And the third part explains how ecological citizenship can help us to specify this ecological limitarian approach to climate justice. So John Locke's theory of property is a possible starting point to think about environmental philosophy. I'm just trying to move my slides. All right. So, for instance, we have Susan Liebel, who is supporting the idea that through John Locke we can base today on environmental liberalism, especially thanks to his enough and as good proviso. And her thesis is that though Locke's focus was not environmental degradation, his understanding of property rights can help theorists retool liberalism to better face environmental change. So more specifically, some philosophers have recently drawn on Locke to think about climate justice. So here I have especially in mind Stéphane Chauvier, Luc Bovens, and also Peter Singer. And they all believe that the appropriation of the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gas is legitimate only where there is enough and as good left in commons for others, according to John Locke's famous proviso. So in this Lockean perspective, the atmosphere's ability to absorb greenhouse gases is identified as a common natural service that must be regulated. The ownership status of the atmosphere is incompatible with certain patterns of greenhouse gas emissions. So here, for instance, this is the way Peter Singer puts this approach. He writes, think of the atmosphere as a giant global sink into which we can pour our gases. then once we have used up the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb our gases without harmful consequences, it becomes impossible to justify our usage of this asset by the claim that we are leaving enough and as good for others. The atmosphere's capacity to absorb our gases has become a finite resource on which various parties have competing claims, and the problem is to allocate those claims justly. So I think looking approaches to climate justice are based on two main features. The first is common ownership of the atmosphere as a ground of distributive justice. And the second ground is the enough and as good proviso to regulate the appropriation of the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. So in such a framework, ecological issues are conceived as problems of natural resources and services scarcity. So the key word here is scarcity. So here I'll put a few examples on how these different authors, Limitarianism, Bourban, and Singer, conceive climate change as a problem of scarcity. I think the problem with these approaches is that they mischaracterize climate change and other contemporary ecological issues, such as biodiversity loss and ozone depletion. These current ecological problems are not problems of resource or service scarcity. They are more accurately characterized as problems of disruptions of global natural systems. The major source of ecological degradation today is no longer the finitude of natural resources and services. It is rather the disruption of the biosphere caused by the explosion of material and energy flows underlying our economic activities since the mid-1950s. So Eric mentioned this in the introduction when he said we are changing context compared to 17th, 18th century philosophers. And I think here what is happening is that the background context is changing, and as a result, the normative question we have to ask ourselves are changing as well. I think in our new context, the main worry is not so much one of scarcity as one of abundance. We have too much oil, coal, and gas to keep atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration at the same level. The atmosphere's capacity to absorb anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions is not limited. The problem is precisely that it keeps absorbing greenhouse gases beyond safe levels, leading to a dangerous climate change. So to sum up, climate change is not so much a problem of absorptive capacity scarcity as one of natural cycle perturbations. So in other words, I think the problem is the following. Those who apply Locke's theory of property to climate change can perhaps develop a sufficient approach based on the everyone should have enough emission rights to live a decent or flourishing life. However, they miss a key feature of contemporary ecological problems that Locke could not have anticipated: the existence of planetary boundaries in the Earth system. This is a very famous figure that represents the 9 planetary boundaries, the two most important ones being climate change and biosphere integrity. So the planetary boundary framework developed over the last decade highlights biophysical threshold in the Earth system. The disruption of overarching planetary level systems causes environmental change that take us out of the stable environmental condition of the Holocene. So as you can see on this figure, there are 4 planetary systems that have already been pushed beyond their critical limits, leading to climate disruption, interference with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, also land system change, and finally biosphere integrity with genetic diversity. If these transgressions persist, the entire planet may be pushed into a new state that would be much less hospitable for human societies. For instance, if we cross the planetary threshold represented here in this second figure of 2 degrees Celsius, the Earth system as a whole can get into what the authors call a Hothouse Earth pathway. The Hothouse Earth pathway is characterized by transcendental dangers, that is, dangers that threaten the condition of human existence on the planet, or at least the condition of a flourishing human life. And I think that Lockean approaches give no indication on how to regulate flows of matter and energy to avoid this kind of danger. They only provide indication on how to regulate access to scarce resources. So in short, while problems of scarcity addressed by Lockean approaches were typical issues of the Holocene, in the Anthropocene, the most worrying ecological issues are related to transgressions in planetary boundaries. So I think this point raises a basic underlying methodological issue. And this issue is the following: the way we conceive empirical structure of climate change and other ecological issues changes the way we conceive the normative issues they raise. So if we conceive, for instance, climate change as a classical problem of resource scarcity, then the most important question is, how can we fairly allocate emission rights at the global level? And there is a huge literature on this question, not only by Lockean approaches, but by a lot of different approaches. However, if we conceive empirically climate change as the perturbation of the carbon cycle, and if we conceive dangerous climate change as the crossing of a critical threshold in the climate system, then the most important question is how to rapidly, drastically, and fairly reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. I think the first question of the fair allocation of emission rights remains relevant, but the overarching topic is the one of a just energy transition, both at the individual and the collective level. So the question now is, what kind of approach would be most suitable to rethink private property in line with this new kind of ecological problem? So I think a good candidate here is the view of distributive justice called Limitarianism. So according to this view, which is relatively new in theories of justice, it is not morally permissible to have more resources than are needed to fully flourish in life. So while sufficientarianism, Lockean or otherwise, sets a lower threshold on the quantity of good people can owe to live a decent or flourishing life, Limitarianism sets an upper threshold on the quantity of goods people should be allowed to owe or to possess. So far in the literature, Limitarianism has focused on economic resources such as income and wealth. This version of Limitarianism is called wealth Limitarianism. Here I would like to propose another approach called Ecological Limitarianism, which sets an upper threshold on the amount of ecological goods or ecological resources individuals have the right to appropriate. So Ingrid Robbins briefly mentioned this approach when she writes, the Limitarianism defended in this chapter is money, Limitarianism, but this doctrine could be supplemented with an additional account of ecological resources, Limitarianism. I think that two basic elements are helpful to sketch an ecological Limitarian approach. So the first element is ecologism. Ecologism is directly related to the core commitment of Limitarianism because it's based on the idea that there are natural limits to economic and population growth. So this view is not a new one. It was first put forward in its fullest form in the Limits to Growth report, landmark report published in 1972. And it has since then been updated by several green political theorists, especially by Andrew Dobson in Green Political Thought. Ecologism claims that profound changes in our lifestyles needs to take place due to the fact that unlimited economic and population growth are incompatible with natural limits. There are different ways to express those limits, but I think that the notion of planetary boundaries is a relevant one. The main reason why we should radically change our relationship with others and the rest of the world is that otherwise we take the risk of crossing planetary boundaries and creating a dangerous world such as the Hothouse Earth pathway. So that's the first element of an ecological limitarianism. The second would be very quickly strong sustainability. According to strong sustainability, the substitution of natural capital by other forms of capital should be limited. So here again, we have this key idea of putting limits to natural resources appropriated by individual agents. In other words, critical, non-substitutable natural resources and ecosystem services should be held constant over time rather than being traded off against economic good. I want to quickly sum up. So far, we can say that ecological limitarianism is not about reconciling economic growth with environmental protection in order to maintain a non-declining stock of economic capital into the future. It is rather about setting limits to economic and population growth in order to protect critical natural resources and services. So now, how can we promote ecological limitarianism? I think there are two main routes, two main intuitive routes we can go down to do so. The first is the institutional approach. So here, I just give two examples of limitarian institutions. Personal emission trading schemes and progressive carbon taxes would be two possible examples of this more institutional or collective approach. But we can also go for the individual approach or the voluntary approach. And here, I think the idea of ecological citizenship can be relevant. And this is the route I would like to follow. So ecological citizenship appeared in the mid-90s in the intellectual context of ecologism, and it was conceived as a renewed and expanded notion of citizenship. And in this context, the principal obligation of the ecological citizen is to have a sustainable ecological footprint. This is a quote by Andrew Dobson in his book Citizenship and the Environment. According to him, the ecological citizen will want to ensure that his or her ecological footprint does not compromise or foreclose the ability of others in present and future generations to pursue options important to them. I think that this is helpful to think about limitarianism in the ecological context and to think about the duties that are specific to this context. By setting an upper threshold on the legitimate use of natural resources and services, ecological citizenship allows to develop the content of ecological limitarianism. The use of the natural capital by moral agents should not be so important that if it were to be universalized, it would foreclose the ability of others in present and future generations to pursue options important to them. So now, this begs the question, but what would a sustainable ecological footprint look like? And we can disaggregate the ecological footprint in several elements, such as, for instance, waste, pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. But I think it is hard to discuss that one key component of the ecological footprint is the carbon footprint, which can be measured quite easily in terms of per capita emissions. So in the climate change literature, the level of sustainability of the carbon footprint is set at approximately 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per person and per year. So if we look at this figure by the World Bank, we can see all developed countries are above 2 tons of CO2 per year, which is small here. So only India is below it. And as you can see, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia are all above it. This means that in those countries, average per capita emissions are currently largely unsustainable. So precisely where the upper threshold should be set is a complex question. I do not claim that 2 tons of CO2 per year is necessarily the relevant upper threshold. I think the level of threshold can differ from country to country and from region to region based on criteria such as the availability and affordability of low carbon energy. I think it's, however, safe to say that average level of per capita emissions in all developed countries are currently unsustainable and therefore above any reasonable interpretation of the upper threshold. So how to adopt a more sustainable carbon footprint? I think that drawing on virtue ethics can help us to reply to this question. It's not only about consequences, it's also about character traits, about dispositions. And there is a small but growing literature in climate justice on green virtues. And here I would like to contribute to this growing literature by proposing what we can call carbon sobriety or carbon frugality as a key virtue ecological citizens can express to fulfill their duty to adopt a sustainable ecological footprint. So carbon sobriety is a form of restraint applied to high emitting activities. It is based on an ethical principle of self-limitations that guides citizens' everyday living. It is not a matter of heroic morality or asceticism, but rather an acquired and stable disposition to enjoy consuming less, to lead a flourishing life by living more frugally. It is not only a moderation in appetites, but a disposition involving the relationship to oneself, to others, and to the rest of the world. So to express carbon sobriety, ecological citizens should adopt so-called high-impact actions. So in the literature, high-impact actions are usually those actions you can see in green here. So they are actions that allow individuals in developed countries to save at least 0.8 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So as you can see here, there's a whole range of actions ecological citizens can take. So adopting a plant-based diet, switching from electric car to car-free, or buy a more efficient car, buy green energy, avoid airplane travel whenever possible, live car-free, and have one fewer child. So all these actions have different levels of effectiveness and demandingness, but they all require to question dominant lifestyles in our industrial societies. And this is totally in line with ecologism, which requires profound changes in our social and political behavior to keep the critical natural capital constant. It is also in line with ecological limitarianism, which sets limits on the personal use of natural resources, such as fossil fuels, and therefore on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions individuals should be entitled to. So the point here is not to say that everyone should pursue all these high impact actions and change radically their lifestyle overnight. I think the limitarian approach can have some flexibility. So we can begin by setting a upper threshold which is quite high, and then gradually lower it over time, so that by 2030 we can go around 2 to 3 tons of CO2 per person per year. So I think there is room for maneuver in almost all these actions. So for instance, before becoming vegan, it's possible to start with flexitarianism and then with vegetarianism. The same with car. Before living car-free, it's possible to buy a smaller car or buy a more efficient car, or an electric car, or a hybrid car, and so on. So one last thing I would like to add to this discussion is that although anyone, however small their abilities, can express carbon sobriety, there is a category of people who are in a privileged position to reduce their carbon footprint. Those are affluent people, and among affluent people, especially rich people. Rich people being those who have a lot of surplus money. These people are more responsible and have more room for action because there is a strong correlation between income and emissions. And this is represented in these two figures you can see here. I will not comment on them too much. I think the interesting point, especially on the left figure, as you can see, is that we have a sort of threshold. So this is part of the latest emissions gap report by the United Nations Environment Programme. And the authors have decided not only to compare per capita emissions from different income earner groups, but they have also decided to set an upper threshold of 2.1 tons of CO2 per year as a target, or as a threshold for 2030. And if we compare different income earner groups, we can see that especially the top percent, and among the top percent, the top 1% of income earners are those who have the most responsibility to reduce their emissions because they are way above this upper threshold. And I think the advantage of having a limitarian approach, which is explained in terms of ecological citizenship, is to have a normative way to justify this kind of upper threshold, for which an empirical approach is not sufficient. So to conclude, I think that an ecological limitarian approach based on virtue ethics can change the way we relate to the natural world. The Earth in general and the atmosphere in particular, in this kind of approach, are no longer conceived as a global common whose parts can be privately appropriated. Ecological stability becomes rather a condition of possibility of human flourishing. Virtues are both about human and non-human flourishing, and this is important because humanity does not flourish in an ecological vacuum. Our individual and collective well-being depend on ecological stability. Individual, social, and ecological flourishing are all interrelated, and I think this is well expressed in this quotation by Phil Caffaro, who writes that our flourishing and nature's flourishing are intertwined. It is no accident that the same actions and the same personality traits typically help us to be good neighbors and citizens and good environmentalists. The same ecosystems, in many cases, facilitate the flourishing of human and non-human beings. Pollution and declining ecosystem health harm both people and other organisms. This view that integrates both human and non-human flourishing is more adapted than a Lockean approach to rethink private property in the Anthropocene. When we think about how to fairly allocate the burdens of climate change, a sufficientarian approach that sets a lower threshold, according to the enough and as good proviso, is not sufficient. To get a complete ethical picture, we also need an approach that sets an upper threshold on personal emissions to avoid a persistent transgression in the climate planetary boundary. In other words, I think we need an ecological limitarian approach. So here I've proposed to base such an approach on ecologism, ecological citizenship, and carbon sobriety, but there are surely other relevant ways to think about it. And in any case, I'm very interested to know what you think about it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Right, thanks very much, Michel, for this very clear presentation. The floor is open for questions. I think we're going to start in the room, and then I'll move online. So who's going to go first? Would you like to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Really interesting. The step I was interested in asking a question about was the one where you showed the distinction between institutional and individual approaches, and then you sort of said that you were going to talk about individuals.
Yes. You want to go back to the slide?
Yeah. No, it's okay. I mean, yeah, just that was the step where I kind of was intrigued because, well, I had two thoughts on that really. The first thought was that I can send you the link, but I remember reading something, someone's done some work about how actually it's the carbon major firms that help to popularize this idea of a carbon footprint. So from very early on, like when the science around climate change kind of started to become really substantial, it's these kind of private benefactors and like people that are benefiting from the status quo that help to kind of make that part of popular consciousness and like part of environmental thinking. So I guess my first worry is just to kind of, I don't know, is there like a sort of tinge of like ideology maybe in this focus on the individual? Is it because it kind of benefits certain groups that we focus on that way and like an individual footprint? So that's the kind of the first question. And the second one is just like, I was trying to think about actually how distinct even are they really? Because surely like you'd need the institutional approach to kind of incentivize certain things. Like you need the state to kind of set up incentives in such a way that individuals are incentivized to do those things that you're talking about. So then I was just thinking maybe you can't really have one without the other. Yeah, that's that's plenty. But thanks for your presentation. It's really good.
Thank you for your questions. So regarding the first one, it's indeed in the interest of firms to say that individuals are responsible because they want to displace responsibility. So we should think about how we frame this kind of individual approach to avoid bringing water to their meals. So I think the reason why I'm so interested in individual responsibility and the reason why there is an increase of focus on this in the literature is because of the same reason why you focus on firms. It's because state action and international action is so disappointing and has been disappointing for so long that we are trying to find new agents who hold new responsibility. And certainly firms are part of them, cities are part of them, but we can also move down to individual action and say, what can we do already as individual independently from the local, national, and international policies who are into place, because these policies currently are completely inadequate to tackle climate change. So I think that's why we should move to the individual level. Regarding your second question, which is how we articulate this more individual voluntarist approach with a more top-down approach with government making regulations and incentives. The whole idea behind ecological citizenship is to say that we should focus first and foremost on what individuals can do voluntarily, independently of policies, because if they just change their behaviors because of outside stimulus such as fiscal incentives, then they will change their behavior just only as long as the policies stay into place. As soon as the government changes and the policy changes, the behaviors of the individuals will change again. So what they want to do in this literature on ecological citizenship is to say that ecological citizens change their behaviors because they change their attitudes first. And this idea of carbon sobriety is to speak about those attitudes, the values of individuals. And when individuals change their values, they will change their behavior in a more sustainable manner than they would do merely for incentive. But saying that does not mean that we should not use incentives. I think it's just that it goes at a deeper level of motivation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was a bit puzzled by that claim that, you know, as soon as then the policy changes or the incentive change, that the behavior would change back. I'm just not sure if that is, like, isn't there a way in which state policy changes can engender kind of dispositions that are kind of strong and that actually don't wane even if the policy changes? Like,
perhaps it's not incentive. For instance, if we speak in terms of regulation, and we make it illegal to perform some forms of action, then it can come into individual values and individual attitudes to say, if it's illegal, it's bad, and even if the policy change, I keep changing my behaviors. But there is a lot of concern, at least in the theoretical literature, to say that with incentives and disincentives, it's not really a sustainable way. So road pricing scheme, carbon taxes, and so on. As soon as they move away, people will just buy more fossil fuels and so on. But we need more empirical proof to say that. But that's the word at least.
Fascinating. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Next question is from Sharon.
Actually, very similar question, like why don't the principle applied at the level of basic structure, but individuals? But you already answered that. But I mean, if we apply your conclusion to the case of wealth inequality, let's say we talk about wealth inequality and we talk about the principle of libertarians, it seems like what you are arguing is that we should ask rich people to donate more to the poor. I mean, if you don't talk about the government role, the political regulation at all. And in that case, it seems a little bit strange for me. So I'm not sure if it's the same for this case. Like we say that we apply the principle of limitarianism, but not at the level of political regulation, but at the level of individuals. We should ask rich people to sacrifice more. I mean, is that making sense? I'm sorry.
So you're speaking about philanthropism?
Limitarianism, like.
But when you say rich people should give more money to poor people, so
I mean, by follow your logic here.
Yes.
we apply, I make analogy to the case of wealth inequality. It's kind of like we are saying that we should resolve the problem of wealth inequality by asking rich people to donate, like to charitize to poor people, which, it's a little bit weird for me. So in this case, it's the same. It's like we said that we should resolve the problem, the ecological problem, by asking rich people to volunteer to do a good deed. And comparing to, I don't know, it's found. Why not? Why don't we talk about the basic structure, the political regulation, where we talk about volunteer, individual volunteers?
Yeah, so the worry is that since the people who hold most responsibility in the limitarian approach is affluent people and rich people, it's not very likely that they will change their behavior, because the behavior causes them to being rich in the first place. So I think that's why it's important to have this other, more institutional approach which sets limits also by, for example, taxing schemes on how much individual owe. So if we look at the wealth limitarian approach, that's typically what they have in mind, and actually economists have been supporting this, like Thomas Piketty. We should limit the wealth people possess, not only by defending abstract duties, but also by developing specific institutions that tax people on a more progressive manner than our societies do right now. So in this case, there would be a redistribution of wealth among societies, but that would not be based on the voluntary action of the rich. It would be based on compulsory actions they have to make, given the incentives came into place. I think that's why we also need incentives, especially given wealth limitarianism.
Great. I'm now going to invite questions from my virtual audience. First person is Wilfried Weber.
Yep. Hello, good to meet you, CEO of Humanity Solutions. I missed some talks today, so if I'm off, then let me know. Responsibility feels like a very soft word to me. You say the rich people pollute much more. I have the feeling it's an underrepresentation because they also invest. So they don't only consume, they also invest in everything else that is polluting. So I find responsibility like a soft word. Why did you choose to go there and not go with liability or aggression or guilt? The justice terms used when there is a crime, a conscious action that causes harm. It feels soft to me.
Yeah.
On that side.
It's a good question. I think it's because we are in the special context of new harms, where the causal relation between those who emit the most and those who have to suffer from the consequences of climate change, there is no clear direct relation. That's something we mentioned before when we were speaking about carbon firms. For instance, Dale Jamieson says we cannot have a backward-looking conception of responsibility in the case of firms, because we cannot directly relate the emitting emissions of firms and specific climate impact. That's why we just only have a forward-looking conception of responsibility based on the ability to pay principle. I think we really need this notion of responsibility, which is indeed very, very broad, to be able to make the case that they are duty despite this lack of direct causal relation. I think with liability, we need this kind of direct relation, at least in the classical conception of the harm principle, which is the foundation of liability. This is the way I understand it, at least. Maybe you have another notion of it in mind, but the reason why I use responsibility is because I conceive it as moral responsibility, and then in the abstract, it's easier to link the emission of the top 1 or top 10% with the situation of people who have to suffer from climate impacts, and then it's easier to make the case that they have a duty to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Does that reply to your question or not?
It does. I just find it dangerous to use the same word for the poor as well as for the rich, because they have a very different level of responsibility, and they are accomplice in a different way, and they are causing it in a very different way. So I just think it's a risk to use the same word for both categories.
Yeah, maybe the distinction we should make is between duty bearers and recipients of justice. So typically in the case of ecological citizenship, the way duties of ecological citizenship are conceived is duties of justice. And the way Dobson conceives it, at least, he says that when people make an excessive use of their ecological space, they have a duty of justice not only to reduce their use of the ecological space, but they also have a duty to compensate harms that came from their excessive use of the ecological space. And here we are more in the language of justice that I think you may be more comfortable with. So that might be one way to qualify what I have in mind when I speak in terms of responsibility. So they are duty bearers and they are recipients of justice. This is maybe clearer.
Okay. Yeah, I will leave the floor to the others. I don't want to.
Thank you. Next person is Charlie Richards.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the paper. I enjoyed it. I'm very sympathetic to lots of it. I suppose I have a clarificatory question and I have a more kind of substantive question. The clarificatory question is, in the limitarian logic that you use, is the conception of flourishing that you employ subjective, i.e. does it turn on, say, the conception of the good that individuals actually hold themselves? Or is the conception of flourishing independent and objective? That is, that we have a kind of independent notion of what human beings need for them to live a flourishing life, and then we set limits accordingly, regardless of how they match up with what people might think of their own lives. I suppose that's the first question. I was unsure about which one of those you employ. And if it is the independent, I think there might be some difficult issues of political legitimacy, maybe, in the face of reasonable disagreement. And then the more substantive question is, I have a concern about your reliance on ecological citizenship grounded in a kind of individual responsibility. Because it seems to me that when we ask people to sacrifice in the name of a kind of collective benefit, there are lots of assurance problems because of the marginal benefits that certain costs can have. I mean, Rawls talks about this in the context of taxation, that people aren't going to be willing to pay tax unless they have explicit assurance that other people will pay theirs, right? Because if, say, I decide not to have any children because I care about the environment, but I have no assurance that anybody else is going to stop having kids. And then not only does it make my cost meaningless, but it also sort of imposes a great burden on my own life. So it seems to me that in these kind of situations, virtue ethics might not get us very far, right? And that we have to rely on some system of enforcement to make sure that people do act in the ways demanded of it, just in terms of an assurance issue. So I was wondering how you might respond to that kind of line of critique, that virtue ethics can't generate the kind of assurance or incentives required for the kind of cost you're asking people to bear.
Okay, thank you very much. So regarding the first question, how to quantify or how to measure flourishing, what represents a flourishing life. So limitarianism was first put forward by Ingrid Robbins, and as you probably know, Ingrid Robbins is a supporter of the capabilities approach, and I think that's the background theory of justice she has in mind when she speaks about a flourishing life. So a flourishing life could be measured by basic capabilities, and we can either go for Nussbaum's approach with a closed list of 10 capabilities, or we can go with Amartya Sen's approach, which is more open regarding the number of basic capabilities. But basically, if we consider that flourishing is based on basic capabilities, then we can measure it, and that's the approach I would go for. And I think in the case of sustainability ethics, the capability approach is very helpful. Actually, both Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum speak about environmental protection, environmental problems, about intergenerational ethics, and I think all this is very helpful to think about how we should reduce our footprint on the environment. And regarding your second question, that's I think anytime we try to take the concept of citizenship and expand it beyond borders of nation state, we will have the problem you have pointed out, which is a problem of lack of reciprocity or non-reciprocity. The reason why, for instance, David Miller supports national responsibility is exactly the reason you have put forward, is that we can expect when we make sacrifice that other people will also make sacrifices in return. And that's why we agree to live together in a society in which we all make sacrifices. If we expand that at the post-national level, and that's what Andrew Dobson is doing, if we believe that we are member of a political community which expands way beyond our national borders because we participate to climate change, which has impact at the other side of the globe, do we still have this kind of reciprocity? I think there is one way to try to keep a certain form of reciprocity. I think the one that always comes to mind is the reciprocity as mutual benefits or reciprocity as mutual sacrifice. And I think we can keep, even if you set this aside, we can still have reciprocity as mutual respect. And I think both are actually present in John Rawls's theory. And I think that there are good reasons to say that reciprocity as mutual respect comes in priority and is a condition of reciprocity as a mutual benefit. So I think that's a more theoretical point about how to read John Rawls, but at least if we agree that if reciprocity as mutual respect is possible, then we can have it beyond national borders, and this would make a certain form of citizenship possible, even if we do not have mutual benefits.
Next question is from Lillian Claude.
I'm sorry.
No,
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you for your presentation. I was interested in critiques of limitarianisms and how you would respond to them, especially in regard to what are these natural limits that the boundary, the planetary boundaries talk about? Are these actual boundaries that kind of constitute an apocalyptic end of the world, which they are not, which has also been argued, or is this limitarianism rather focused on human agency and like kind of a self-limitation, which has also been put forward as a like new Kantian approach of like self-limitation, which is not necessarily like a constraint, but like a voluntarily act of limiting human agency, or like the amount of like how we affect the environment. And I was just thinking in your argument of limitation or limitarianism that you want to include in ecological citizenship, how do you cope with these like many different sorts of limits that we have here into play? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the reason I mentioned all these different forms of limits are planetary boundaries, upper threshold, and flexible upper threshold is that I'm trying to find the best candidates to express ecological limitarianism. So I'm not yet totally clear on that. I think the most helpful way to think about limitarianism is to use this kind of virtue ethics approach, because as you said, it's related to this idea of self-limitation. So when we impose ourselves limitations on our behavior, we can do so, of course, by following a more deontological approach, more consequentialist approach, or more a virtue ethics approach. I think the advantage of the virtue ethics approach is definitely to bring to the conversation this idea of stable disposition and character traits, to explain why it's not only something that is negative, but also that it can be included in our rational life plan to make sense of the way we live. And I think what I'm trying to do is to to specify what an ecological citizen is about, really. When Dobson speaks about the virtue of the ecological citizen, he just mentions justice, and I think that's not sufficient because we can speak about distinctively ecological virtues, about green virtues, which he does not. And I think that's why if we add these green virtues such as carbon sobriety, we can get a better picture of what being an ecological citizen is about. And I think another virtue we can mention is the one discussed by Dale Jamieson when he speaks about mindfulness. And here what he has in mind is typically that we should be aware of the effect our ecological footprint has on Earth. And to do so, the kind of theory I've used here, such as the planetary boundary framework, I think this is a possible way to ground mindfulness. The reason why mindfulness can lead to carbon sobriety is because we become more aware of the existence of those planetary boundaries. So that's not a systematic way to reply to your question, but that's where I'm at currently. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Is there enough time for a quick follow-up, maybe?
A very quick one then.
Okay, very quick.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was also very interested in bringing virtue ethics in into the discussion here. And and I was also thinking of Georgios Kallis, for instance, who I think 2 years ago or last year wrote exactly criticizing limitarianism and planetary boundaries from an ecological perspective, and also introduced again a kind of self-limitation based on a Greek idea of justice, which also kind of resonates with virtue ethics. And I was just wondering whether ecological citizenship and an ethics based in it really fits into or really can really work with virtue ethics as the relationship with the environment, and not only with it's not only about discussing virtues in terms of intersubjectivity between people, but with the environment. And I was just wondering whether we can really still stick to this framework of a kind of virtue ethics which comes from ancient Greece.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with bringing ethics into the discussion about justice and citizenship is to be very clear about what kind of background normative ethics we have in mind. So we can go, again, I think there is a consequentialist, a deontological or virtue ethics case we can make for ecological citizenship. And I think what I was trying to do here is to be precise about what kind of normative ethics I have in the background of my thought. Yes, I think there was something else I wanted to add, but I forgot it. Yes, yeah, I will stay at that. Sorry, I think it slipped my mind. Sorry.
Okay, well, as it happens, we run out of time for the session, so we're going to stop here with a lot of thanks to Michel for a very interesting discussion. And we're going to move on to the next paper by Carl Pierer. Carl is a researcher at ENS. Can you hear us, Carl?
Yes, I can hear you. I will just try to share my screen.
Sure. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for the brilliant talks so far, and for allowing me to talk here. I'm going to talk about the nature of property and its relation to concepts of labor today. And the argument that I'm going to present today is drawn from my master's thesis, where I examined the links between concepts of labor and concepts of nature. And I'm going to explore a lot of these issues and related topics in the PhD in politics, which I will be starting in October at the University of Cambridge with Duncan Kelly. So what I'm going to talk about today is all very much work in progress. Yeah, I'm very happy to discuss these questions with you. So the structure of today's talk is I will give a brief introduction where I'll briefly summarize the argument that I'm going to make today. Then I will look at the traditional link that exists between concepts of property and concept of labor, in particular in Locke. In a third section, I will argue that underlying this link between property and labor is a certain concept of external nature, which has come under stress by ecological crisis, and especially theoreticians such as Latour and Haraway, who question this nature-culture dualism that arises from this external concept of nature. And in a fourth section, I will propose a different concept of labor that can present us with a different relation to nature. And finally, I will look at what this means for the concept of property. So the argument that I'm going to make today will start from what I call the exclusion principle. I will explain this in detail a little bit later, but roughly it says that the owner of a resource or a property holder can dispose of that property as they see fit. And as I understand it, it is this exclusion principle that creates a conflict between private property and environmental concerns, because these environmental concerns are external to the property that is held. My thesis is that this exclusion principle is already present in the Lockean argument for private property, and it quickly leads to a long list of attempts to qualify the exclusion principle and to rein it in, and to account for other rights that may stand in conflict with it. The Lockean argument, as is very well known, relies on a sort of productive concept of labor, of producing something out of nature. And this productive concept of labor stands in direct relation to an external concept of nature, so a concept of nature that has to be transformed to be of use to humans. I will then argue that this concept of nature is in trouble due to the ecological crisis that we witness, which will lead me to my first conclusion, that we need indeed a new concept of labor. In the second part, I will argue that the productive concept of labor obscures its own foundations, so that the productive concept of labor presupposes certain assumptions that it does not properly develop. And this foundation is the reproduction of the force that goes into productive labor. And that this concept of reproduction in consequence implies a different relation to nature and a different concept of nature as well. And moreover, without the productive concept of labor, the exclusion principle loses its foundation. And so this leads me to the conclusion that the reproductive concept of labor can help mediate the conflicts between property and the environment. So to begin exploring the traditional link that exists, what I'm trying to do today is not to ask the question in terms of limits or adding further duties to property holders, but rather to also change the relation to nature and to thereby ask the question about the relation between the environment and private property in a different way. Instead of seeing it as a conflict between freedom, which is based on private property, and the necessity to somehow preserve nature, this will allow to configure the debate differently. Freedom and property do not function in this configuration as something absolute that is abstracted from its material and environmental context, and has then to be reined in by external necessities and limits that are imposed on these concepts, but rather the freedom and the property are inherently bound by responsibility. So to begin with, I will start with Jeremy Waldron, who distinguishes between property and private property, where the former property is simply any system of rules that govern the access and the control of material objects, and private property is related to questions of ownership, or more precisely, to cite, in the case of each object, the individual person whose name is attached to that object is to determine how the object shall be used and by whom. This is broadly the notion that I have in mind when I talk about the exclusion principle, and that is to decide at the exclusion of others about the use of a resource. This interpretation is also supported by others, for example, Thomas Merrill, who in his paper Property and the Right to Exclude argues that in fact the right to exclude is the essential right in the bundle of rights in private property from which all other rights follow. Moreover, this exclusion principle is already present in the Lockean account of private property. So let me then move on to Locke's theory. In order to properly understand the historical context in which this argument is formulated, I believe that we have to talk about the idea of improvement that sets the background of this development. Often this idea of improvement is presented as a sort of ethic and a particular practice related to the development of agriculture in England during the modern period. There, the improver combined reason and experience to form and improve nature that existed out there. According to Paul Ward, this idea is largely correct, but the development is somewhat more complex. In particular, he shows that this concept is not just limited to agriculture. He shows that in the 16th century, the term applied mostly to the improvement of rental value. And then at the beginning of the 17th century, it transformed into a sort of metaphorical use for improving different aspects of one's life and becoming a better person. And towards the end of the 17th century, it acquires a new meaning again, and it keeps this meaning throughout the 18th century. And this is, here I cite again, improvement had become the express mission of government and the stated intention of laws. The whole surface of the land could be now assigned to two categories, improved and unimproved. And this idea of improvement, I think, is very important because it explains why the attention in Locke is on labor rather than on the laborer. Because the improvement requires heavy investments. It is mostly carried out by large landowners that in this way put to use their capital. Improvement appears as the work of he who has taken the initiative and risked his capital in increasing the value of a given plot of land. With this, I can now quickly move on to summarize Locke's argument. He starts, as is well known, from the premise that the world is given to all humanity by God, and raises the question of how property can be justified in this context. He further argues that the goods of nature have to be appropriated before they can be of use to anyone, and before they can be of use to any individual, they have to become part of that individual. So there must be a means by which humans can appropriate these gifts of nature, otherwise they would just be useful. And of course, this means is nothing other than labor, because in labor, humans mix a part of themselves to which no one else has a claim with part of nature, which belongs to everyone, and thereby make it their own. So I can cite Locke on this. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. Of course, there are lots of further aspects to this argument that I can't treat here, but this is the key idea. And what I'm particularly interested in here is the underlying concept of nature that it works with. In the further part of Locke's argument, the question quickly turns to how to limit this appropriation. Given that property means exclusive rights to the owned object, the question becomes how to make sure that this doesn't get abused, how to ensure the freedom and the right of the property of others. And I think that this focus on the limitations is in fact due to the underlying concept of nature. To quickly sketch this concept of nature, it's presumed to be valueless by itself. It's useless as long as it's not appropriated or improved by humans. It doesn't have any interest of its own, and it doesn't have any activity. It just lies out there, eternal, passive. In what follows, I propose to change this frame and propose a different way of asking the question. So let me talk about the dualism between nature and culture. the concept of nature that we've seen here constructs at the same time a corresponding concept of politics and culture. And all phenomena are to be sorted into either of these two spheres. While the argument against the nature-culture dualism has been developed a lot over the last 30 years, it remains a very contested idea. And lots of the theoreticians, such as Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, Val Plumwood, remain sort of controversial figures and contested, especially from the point of view of critical theory. I can't provide a full argument against this dualism here, but give two suggestions for why maybe it might be useful to think beyond this dualism. So the first point is Latour's reading of Plato's Cave. In fact, he says that this division into a sphere of nature that is passive, governed by eternal laws, about which facts can be established, opposed to a sphere of culture or politics where that is characterized by eternal debates, different values, that is the domain of the humanities in general, is in fact already a political division of the world, but passes as an epistemological division. So if we think about Plato's cave, we have the part where people are chained in the cave, cannot overcome the eternal debates that reign between them, and make false ideas, do not really get to the truth. And we have the part that lies outside the cave, which is the sphere of nature, which we may call the sphere of nature, where the eternal truths are established. And we have one person that manages to move between these two spheres, and that is the scientist. The scientist moves outside of the cave, observes nature, establishes facts about this nature, and brings it back into the cave and sort of settles the debate once and for all with the facts that they have established. Of course, by itself, the fact that this is a political division is not an argument against this dualism, but it may give us certain reasons for considering why we have set up the world in this way and why we do it this way. In other words, it's not natural to divide it up in this way. The second reason is that the dualism makes it difficult to account for the phenomena that we experience and that we observe, especially ecological crises. If indeed this nature-culture dualism is exhaustive and requires us to sort whatever we observe in the world into either a sphere of nature about which we can establish eternal, indubitable truths, as done by science, or a sphere of culture, which is just a question of values, of discussions, and where no ultimate truth may be achieved, then we run into serious problems with phenomena such as, for example, the COVID-19 crisis. Because in such ecological crises, we are confronted with a tangle of very different aspects that come together. At the same time, we have a certain natural, what in the traditional conception, in a traditional dualistic conception would be natural, the comportment of the virus, how it gets transmitted, how it provokes sickness, and what it does to the human body. But at the same time, we also have a lot of cultural aspects that feed into it. The fact that it can spread in such a way over the whole world is due to our current state of development, to the interlinks between economies in different parts of the world, and so on. And the difficulty in managing it is, of course, also related to political systems and political organizations. So in order to properly understand this COVID-19 crisis, we need to bring together both aspects that are traditionally natural, such as epidemiology, but also sort of cultural aspects, political analysis, cultural analysis, etc. So these two suggestions simply to say that maybe we need to think more about this nature-culture dualism, and maybe it might be good to go beyond this dualism. So let me move on to a different concept of labor than the productive concept of labor. So we've seen in Locke a concept of labor that reposes on the idea we take a valueless nature, transform it, appropriate it, and thus make it useful. This is quite simple simple concept that has had a very long history and has been very influential, and I think it can be seen in the works of Hegel and Marx and even Arendt. The idea that we take a natural resource, transform it, and produce something new out of it. However, in the 70s, feminist thinkers have started to show that, in fact, this productive labor is supported by a hidden foundation. And this hidden foundation is no other than the reproductive activities that take place in the home. So all the stuff that goes on that is necessary to make sure that the laborer can turn up in the morning at 8 at the factory and start producing the goods that they produce. So this includes feeding the worker, it includes cleaning the home and clothing the worker, and so on and so forth. So the question then becomes, why consider these activities, these reproductive activities, as labor? Why have a concept of labor that takes into account both productive and reproductive activities? So one reason, and I think this is perhaps one of the most important reasons, is that that the concept of labor implies a concept of nature. So if we want to test our concept of labor, we need to see what kind of nature it implies. The suggestion here is that reproductive labor can be helpful because it pushes us to the question, who is doing the work? And if we think about reproductive labor, this allows us to extend activity beyond merely the human. We arrive at a new subject of who is active in this reproductive labor. And the second aspect is that the concept of labor implies recognition. By casting certain activities as work, we put ourselves in a position to recognize the effort that goes into it. They are not simply natural activities. So this is the main motivation in, for example, the work of Federici, to show that the whole activity that goes into making the household run is not anything natural. It's not natural for women to sit at home and cook and feed the worker, but it's work. It's as unnatural and as constructed in a large sense as the factory work. So here I will cite Federici. She writes, "Wages for housework is the demand by which our nature ends and our struggle begins, because just to want wages for housework means to refuse that work as the expression of our nature," she's talking about women here, "and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us." And so what does this reconfigured concept of labor mean for the concept of nature in inverted commas? I think that several conceptual reconfigurations are necessary to truly overcome the nature-culture dualism. But one important aspect is to consider activity not confined to the sphere of humans. In order to avoid considering nature as simply sitting out there passively, we need to develop concepts that allow us to think humans and non-humans engaged in activities together. And the concept of productive labor can be particularly useful here because it invites us to ask who is doing the work. And the reproduction of a common world thus appears as a common activity of humans and non-humans. This idea is at the heart of Elisa Battistoni's paper, Bringing in the Work of Nature, which has been a tremendous influence. And she writes in this paper, "I propose conceiving of the reproduction of the conditions of life on Earth, the continuous rebuilding of our common livable home as a form of collective hybrid labor. We must also recognize the generative productive forces of nature itself as part of this labor. The daily remaking of the world requires more than human activity." So, what does all this development mean for property? Property can no longer be carved out from a shared natural world devoid of value by mixing with it through labor a part of ourselves to which nobody else has a claim. Because now we have a different underlying concept of labor. It's not creating value out of nothing, but reproducing this value that exists already in the world. We have a different underlying concept of nature. we are engaged in the nature, or non-humans are engaged in the same activity as us and with us of reproducing this common world and this common shared value. And now we have a different concept of property as well, because it's not at the exclusion of others, but arises as some sort of obligation, as some responsibility, because we are engaged in the reproduction of this shared property. Let me talk a little bit more about this, about exclusion versus responsibility. In fact, we're no longer talking about externalities. If the arbitrary division of nature culture can be overcome by this concept of labor, then the concept of property is no longer only attached to the sphere of culture. Side effects do not simply lie outside of the concept of property, but are part of it. So for instance, if you have ownership of a lake because you have appropriated it by maintaining it, its deterioration, whether through neglect or willfully, is not simply a choice to dispose of your property as you see fit, but rather it goes against the very justification you have for having ownership of this lake. So the responsibility becomes part of your claim of property. To conclude, let me give a brief outlook of where this work in which directions this work can be developed. One of the most important questions, and this is what I also plan to be doing in my PhD, is to examine the subject of reproductive work. Who is doing the work? Does considering reproductive labor as being done jointly by humans and non-humans not simply represent the dualism in new clothes? So we have humans on the side of culture and non-humans on the side of nature. And related to this question, the question of whether non-humans could hold ownership of certain aspects of certain resources. And yeah, this will be a central part of my PhD research, and I think that the concept of nature cultures, as we find it in Haraway's work, can provide this new type of subject that profoundly mixes together humans and non-humans. The second direction into which this can be developed is the question of value. What I've been talking about today is a very economic understanding of value. And one might wonder if there might not be a different kind of value. If, for example, nature, untouched nature, wilderness does not have its own kind of value. If this is of interest, we can maybe discuss about this in the questions. I don't think that this is a weakness of my approach, but rather a strength. But I'm happy to discuss about this in the questions. And the final direction that might be interesting to develop is the question between property and private property, whether in this context with a configured concept of labor, it still makes sense to talk about private property. And I think this is quite a tricky question, and I don't really have an answer as of yet, but I think it's both. It's no, because it's no longer the private property of a human individual, but yes, because it might be possible to configure this as the private property of a new type of subject, and that links back to the nature cultures. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
That's great. Thanks very much, Carl. We'll start with questions from the room. Anyone? Jamie.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. So I was just, it's just a small kind of suggestion really on the idea of the kind of concept of nature and the nature culture divide. So I think there's some good work by Stephen Vogel on this, on whether the concept of nature is a kind of concept worth keeping or whether it can be jettisoned, which I think speaks to some of the concerns that you've been raising here. So I just wanted to flag that really. It's not particularly a question, just a kind of quick suggestion.
Thank you.
Can I ask something? So what you were describing made me think of non-anthropocentric, say, Aboriginal philosophies, whereby we have to think of nature not as something that's external to us, but we as human beings are very much a part of nature, as opposed to doing something to nature. So I was wondering whether you see affinities between what you're doing and those philosophies, because it seems to me that on the other hand, your focus on questions of work and activity and labor still remain really anthropocentric, right? It's hard to think of a way in which non-human can labor. Right? It seems to me that the concept of labor itself has to be an anthropocentric concept.
Yeah, thank you a lot for that question. I think it's very interesting. So unfortunately, I don't know very much about Aboriginal philosophies, but this dualism between nature and culture has also been cast as quite an Occidental Western way of seeing this by Descola, for example, who showed also that there are different ontologies of organizing this relation. And about the anthropocentricity of the labor concept, I think this is quite a quite a tricky bit. I'm sort of continuing in the line of Battistoni as she develops it in her paper, where she reacts to ways of bringing nature into economic rationality through concepts such as natural capital. And by focusing on labor, she suggests a way of politicizing these subjects, non-human subjects, in a different way. And I'm quite partial to this, because the main difficulty I see with abandoning the nature-culture dualism, and especially in the work of Latour, is that it lacks ways of accounting for traditional political dynamics, sort of traditional concepts of exploitation or of oppression. It's difficult to account for those in this new framework. And by focusing on labor, we can mobilize, I think we can mobilize sort of a long tradition of thinking about exploitation and oppression through this concept. But of course, there's a sort of anthropocentric content, which I probably will have to think about more.
Thank you. I have a question from Eric Fabry.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for this presentation. Well, it's super interesting, really. I also more of a comment. I don't know if you're aware of G.A. Cohen's book, Self-Ownership, Freedom, Equality. But he has a chapter, if I will remember, he has a chapter where he clearly examines the Lockean argument that says, well, the liberal has the right to the value that he created because he created the value of the thing, basically. That's kind of the argument that he's trying to analyze. And what he shows is that this argument relies on the idea that the labor creates like the whole value of the thing, and that the nature creates nothing at all. And what he points out quite interestingly is that if you have this reading, the argument is contradictory. I don't remember exactly the detail. I just remember the conclusion, but that's something I think you might want to look to. Might actually go in your sense. And just a question, but it's quite a broad question, so sorry for that. But why, basically, well, to put it a bit harshly, why come back to Locke? I mean, if what you want to do is to defend this new kind of, this new conception of labor and this new conception of nature and property rights, I understand why the libertarians come back to Locke. I mean, they can defend absolute property rights and have this idea, but if what you want to do is to have this alternative view on property, why not endorse a conventionalist approach and clearly say, okay, well, property rights are conventions, and they depend on the kind of representation that we have on nature, on what labor is, and so on, and just develop your argument in a conventionalist way. So I think there must be something that attracts you to Locke, and I was wondering, what is it? What is this thing that you think? What is it? Well, sorry. What is it that you think is really worth in Locke's arguments somehow?
I think the main reason for going back to Locke is that it's a very clear exposition of the problem, and it very clearly shows the concept of nature that grounds the argument. And secondly, that it's sort of at the origin of the whole modern philosophical concept of labor that then continues in Hegel and Marx, and against which these feminist writers such as Federici react. And so that is basically the main motivation of going back to Locke. And yeah, and thank you for the recommendations. It's excellent.
Great. Next question is from Eva Weiler.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Well, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. My question relates a bit to the question before, maybe. So, because I was wondering what really changes in the notion of property if you change the notion of labor, unless you stick to Locke's model of property actually being a relation between the owner and the thing that is owned. Because otherwise I wouldn't really see, if you take property as a legal title, then it doesn't have to be private property, and then you can, I don't know, have different understandings of how you get private property and so on. So that would be another question then. So I was wondering what kind or what notion of property you actually have, and in what way it would be changed just by changing the concept of labor, which I find very, well, I would agree to what you said, but I don't really see how that changes the concept of property.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. I think, yeah, so related to the previous question, so one of the reasons of going back to Locke is that it gives a very clear justification for private property and saying, oh yeah, why do we have this and why do we need this? And if we go back to this argument of justifying the private property in this way, which might be slightly outdated, but then we also see that with this new concept of labor, we have a different justification for holding private property, because now it's not the justification doesn't lie in the fact that we transform something valueless into something that has value and that is suddenly useful for human beings, but the justification resides in the fact that we maintain this common world, or this common object, and if we let it deteriorate, if we deplete the resource, then we go against this very justification of our claim of ownership. But yeah, potentially that's the ways of reacting to this by saying that there are new ways of accounting for the ownership, giving justification for the ownership.
Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is from Niklas Angerbauer.
Yes, so another question from Germany. Hi there. Brilliant talk. Thank you so much. I really loved it, mostly because I'm working on a very similar project, I believe, but I think it's what you presented is just great. I wanted to stress you a little bit on the question of exploitation, because I think another problem that Locke has, and which you also kind of mentioned, is not just his conception of labor, of nature, but also his conception of dependent labor. And of course, this goes like to the whole Marx debate and stuff, and so on. So my question is simply, what about capitalism, or what about like dependent labor? How do you deal with that from the kind of perspective you're developing, or how far down the road into this exploitation critique do you want to go?
So in the research that I envisage to do is basically to go further down this concept of labor, to be able to use the resources of critical theory and mostly of Nancy Fraser to precisely give an account of how this sort of labor gets exploited in the capitalist system. So to what in one of her papers she calls the hidden abodes of capitalism, and to kind of provide a way of thinking together this picture with the idea of overcoming the nature culture dualism, because that this remains something I believe that in Fraser's account, she strictly separates the sphere of the social from the sphere of the natural. That is in trouble in these ecological crises. So I would go further down this road. Yeah.
Any other question or comments? Anyone? Either here in the room or online? Anyone? Okay, well, I think we are going. Oh, Antonio Manconi, did you have your hand up? Antonio? Has someone raising their hand? I can't see what it is. Wilfried, Wilfried, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please, welcome back.
Hello. Yeah, in legal terms, you have for entrepreneurs, you have this notion of vesting, and so you gradually gain equity in a company over time. The more effort you put in, you get equity. And so there's these notions and some legal tools that allow for a fluid conception of ownership and co-ownership, and so a more fluid approach. Have you looked into these legal tools that exist and how that relates to what you're doing?
Not yet, no. Yeah, but okay. This is a great suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, because there are ways to gradually fade in or fade out of ownership also legally, besides the legitimacy point. Okay. I would be very interested in continue the dialogue on that point with you if you're interested in that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks very much. Much food for thought there. So we're going to leave it here, and it's time for a coffee break. So we're going to have a brief pause, and we'll resume at 3:30, so in just over 20 minutes. Thank you very much, everyone.
Just thanks again, and just so we will have only Stuart White's presentation afterwards, since we had one paper missing. So this will leave us plenty of time for discussing Stuart's paper, and we'll be good. So see you in 20 minutes. Thank you, Cécile.